Some ships become legends because they sank. Titanic became a legend because it never stopped telling its story. For more than a century, most people have believed the story ended in the freezing waters of the North Atlantic on the night of April 14, 1912. Books were written. Award-winning films recreated its final hours frame by frame. Generations grew up assuming they already knew everything worth knowing about the most famous shipwreck in history. But the richest chapter of this story may not have begun until decades later, almost 2.5 miles beneath the surface of the Atlantic Ocean. Long after the survivors were gone and the last eyewitnesses had fallen silent, one witness remained exactly where history had left it. Hidden under darkness, crushing pressure, and drifting sediment, the wreck simply waited. It didn't speak through memory or opinion. It kept evidence instead. Every twisted beam, every shattered window, every silent hallway became part of an enormous archive that no historian, journalist, or investigator had been able to examine for the first 73 years after the disaster. Then, in 1985, everything changed. An expedition finally located the wreck resting on the ocean floor, and the world celebrated it as the end of a mystery. In reality, it was the start of a completely different investigation. When cameras first drifted across that massive steel bow, they revealed something nobody expected. This wasn't simply a grave. It was a time capsule. Rooms that had once echoed with conversation sat untouched in total darkness. Personal belongings remained exactly where they'd last been placed. Structural damage that had stayed hidden for generations could finally be examined instead of imagined. Historians no longer had to rely only on testimony, newspaper reports, or official inquiries. For the first time, the ship itself had a seat at the table. And sometimes physical evidence tells a very different story than memory does. Over the decades that followed, expedition after expedition returned with new images and new observations, not because anyone was hunting for treasure, but because the ship kept revealing details nobody had expected to find. Some discoveries confirmed what investigators had suspected for years. Others challenged assumptions that millions of people had simply accepted as fact. Rather than closing old debates, the wreck kept opening new ones. Why had certain sections survived so much better than others? Why did some of the damage look nothing like the early reconstructions? What could the scattered artifacts on the seafloor tell us about those final moments aboard the ship? Maybe the biggest surprise of all is this: Titanic stopped being just a story about one tragic night in 1912. It became one of the longest-running historical investigations ever carried out beneath the sea. Every dive adds another piece to a puzzle that still isn't finished, and every new image is a reminder that history isn't something frozen inside a textbook. Sometimes it waits patiently in the dark until we finally learn to ask better questions. And somewhere among the countless secrets still resting inside that wreck, there are almost certainly discoveries waiting that could reshape everything we think we already know. There's something unsettling about certainty, especially the kind that survives for generations without anyone questioning it. Ask nearly anyone what happened that night and the answers sound familiar. The ship struck an iceberg. It split apart. It vanished beneath the waves. Survivors told their stories, investigators reached their conclusions, and history got neatly filed away. Except history has a habit of shifting whenever new evidence is finally allowed to speak. Before the wreck was found, almost everything people believed came from two sources: human memory and official inquiries. Both were valuable, but both carried limits that any historian will admit to. Memories fade. Perspectives differ from person to person. Even the most honest witness can only describe what they personally saw, often from one location, often in the middle of confusion and fear. Investigators, however thorough, could only study what remained above the waterline. The largest witness of all, the ship itself, sat completely beyond reach for more than 7 decades. Every reconstruction of that night depended on pieces of a puzzle nobody could fully verify. Artists painted illustrations. Engineers built theories. Writers filled the gaps with careful research, and filmmakers added details that eventually felt like part of the historical record. Somewhere along the way, millions of people stopped separating documented fact from dramatic interpretation. Certain scenes became so familiar they started to feel historical, even when they were built on educated guesswork rather than physical proof. Then the ocean floor offered something no archive on land ever could. It offered silence without distortion. Steel doesn't remember anything. It simply stays where it lands. Every fracture, every collapsed deck, every section resting exactly where gravity dropped it became part of a record untouched by fading memory or shifting generations. Investigators could finally compare long-accepted explanations against the physical condition of the ship itself. Some conclusions held up remarkably well. Others turned out to be far messier than anyone expected. Researchers learned that the wreck didn't just answer old questions. It forced entirely new ones. Why did certain structural failures happen exactly where they did? Why were some areas preserved almost perfectly while others had nearly vanished? What could scattered debris reveal about movements no surviving witness ever saw? Each expedition came back with photographs, measurements, and observations that turned speculation into real evidence, while also exposing just how much remained uncertain. That's what makes this wreck so different from almost any other historical artifact. It isn't sitting behind museum glass in a climate-controlled room. It rests in one of the most inaccessible places on Earth, slowly changing with every year that passes. Corrosion keeps working. Marine life keeps reshaping surfaces. Time itself is still editing the record. Every visit becomes more than an exploration. It becomes a race to document details before they disappear for good. And maybe that's the biggest misconception people carry. Many imagine that finding the wreck was the final chapter of the investigation. In truth, it was the moment assumptions began giving way to evidence, and when one of history's most familiar stories quietly turned into one of its most fascinating unfinished cases. As investigators spent more time studying the wreck, something remarkable started to happen. The teams weren't looking at a famous ship anymore. They were exploring what amounted to a perfectly sealed historical archive, untouched since 1912 beneath nearly 2.5 miles of water. Unlike a museum, where every artifact gets arranged to tell a tidy story, everything down there sat exactly where chance, gravity, and time had left it. Every observation had to start with a simple question. Why was this object still here while another had disappeared completely? Why had one section stayed recognizable while another collapsed into a tangled maze of steel? The answers were rarely simple. Ocean currents, pressure, corrosion, and microscopic marine life had all been quietly reshaping the site for decades. Yet even as nature altered the wreck, it also protected countless details from human interference. Walking through the ship was impossible, but remotely operated vehicles let researchers glide through spaces no investigator from the original inquiries could have imagined seeing. Corridors emerged from the darkness. Staircases still hinted at the elegance they once had. Cabins, transformed by time, still preserved the outlines of everyday life. These scenes reminded researchers this was never purely an engineering story. It was a place where thousands of ordinary moments had happened long before history remembered a single extraordinary night. Every room raised another question rather than settling one. Why had certain furnishings survived while others vanished entirely? Why did some personal belongings look almost untouched while nearby materials had rotted beyond recognition? The ocean hadn't preserved the wreck evenly. It had created an unpredictable record that investigators had to interpret with real care. Every photograph became evidence. Every measurement mattered. Engineers examined fractured steel, comparing the physical damage against century-old testimony. Marine archaeologists mapped the debris scattered across the seafloor and discovered the field stretched farther than early reconstructions had assumed. Historians compared these findings against survivor accounts, not to prove anyone wrong, but to understand how physical evidence and human memory could actually work together. Often they did. Other times they showed just how hard it is to reconstruct events experienced through confusion, darkness, and sheer panic. The most valuable lesson may have come from what investigators couldn't immediately explain. Some discoveries fit comfortably into what was already known. Others resisted easy interpretation entirely. Rather than force the evidence into a familiar narrative, responsible researchers let unanswered questions stay unanswered. That discipline turned every expedition into something far more valuable than a hunt for dramatic revelations. It became an ongoing conversation between history and evidence. The deeper the cameras traveled into that silent interior, the clearer one truth became. The wreck wasn't just preserving the past. It was quietly correcting it, one observation at a time. And with every new survey, investigators realized they hadn't reached the end of the archive. They'd only just opened its first pages. Each dive since has added another layer to that record, and researchers now openly admit that the site will likely keep producing new questions for as long as anyone keeps returning to look. One of the biggest surprises wasn't a dramatic object sitting on the ocean floor. It was the discovery that the wreck consistently rewarded patient observation over bold assumption. Early investigations naturally leaned on survivor testimony, engineering knowledge, and whatever limited evidence existed above the surface. Those conclusions were thoughtful and detailed for their era. But the ship itself introduced a completely new category of evidence. It didn't replace the earlier accounts. It let researchers compare them against physical reality. In several cases, that comparison strengthened confidence in long-accepted findings. In others, it revealed history was far more complicated than anyone had imagined. Engineers studying the bow found damage supporting the idea that the collision was devastating, though it didn't match every popular illustration from the last century. Instead of one dramatic gash in the hull, close examination suggested a far more complex pattern of structural failure spread across multiple sections. That distinction sounds technical, but it changed the conversation. It reminded historians that disasters usually unfold through a chain of connected events rather than one single dramatic moment. Another lesson came from the debris fields scattered across the seafloor. At first glance, those thousands of objects looked almost random, but careful mapping revealed patterns. Every suitcase, every piece of machinery, every fragment of furniture had traveled according to physics, currents, and the sequence of the ship's final descent. By documenting exactly where these objects rested, researchers gained real clues about how different sections separated and reached the bottom. The wreck wasn't simply being photographed anymore. It was being read like a document. Even ordinary details turned out to matter. The position of railings, the condition of windows, the shape of collapsed decks, the orientation of heavy equipment, all of it became evidence. None of these details alone explained the whole story. Together, they formed a picture that grew sharper with every expedition. This process also corrected a common misconception. Many people assumed one expedition uncovered every important answer. In reality, understanding built up slowly over decades. Advances in underwater imaging, remotely operated vehicles, digital mapping, and three-dimensional modeling let later teams notice details earlier technology simply couldn't capture. Every generation of explorers inherited the work of the ones before them, adding new layers instead of erasing old ones. Perhaps the most remarkable part of this whole investigation is that the strongest conclusions rarely came from spectacular discoveries. They came from patient comparison, repeated measurement, and a willingness to let evidence challenge comfortable assumptions. That's one of the most important principles in historical investigation. The goal was never to force the past into a familiar story. The goal was to let the surviving evidence guide the story, even when it led somewhere unexpected. And as researchers kept assembling this enormous underwater archive, they started noticing something even more intriguing. Beyond the engineering evidence and scattered artifacts, the ship was preserving traces of everyday life, a different kind of history measured not just in steel and structure, but in the quiet presence of the people who once walked its decks. As the investigation moved past structural damage, another layer of the underwater archive started to emerge, one that no engineering diagram could ever measure. It became clear the ship was preserving something far more personal than steel. Scattered across cabins, corridors, and open sections of the wreck were quiet reminders that every deck had once been filled with ordinary routines. Shoes rested wherever the currents had carried them. Dishes sat stacked inside storage compartments. Decorative fixtures still clung to walls that hadn't seen daylight in more than a century. None of it was dramatic, yet all of it carried real historical weight. It turned an engineering investigation into a human one. Researchers quickly learned every artifact needed to be approached with genuine restraint. The goal was never to collect objects just because they were old or valuable. Each item was evidence that could reveal how people actually lived aboard that ship before history remembered only its final hours. A suitcase, a pair of eyeglasses, a porcelain dish, a section of furniture, any of these could help historians reconstruct daily life with surprising accuracy. Together, these ordinary objects challenged one of the most common assumptions about famous disasters. People often imagine history gets shaped only by extraordinary events, but the physical record suggests something different. History is built from countless ordinary moments that suddenly matter because they happen to survive. Marine archaeologists also face a difficult question that still sparks debate today. Should artifacts stay exactly where they've rested for generations, or should some be recovered before corrosion and biological activity erase them forever? Reasonable people land on different sides. Some argue the site deserves to stay untouched out of respect. Others believe carefully documented recovery preserves knowledge that would otherwise vanish. Rather than pretending there's a simple answer, the ongoing debate reflects a challenge archaeologists face everywhere. Every excavation balances preservation against discovery. Every decision changes what future generations get to study. Technology has eased some of that tension. High-resolution imaging, photogrammetry, and three-dimensional digital reconstruction now let researchers document huge sections of the wreck without physically disturbing anything. Millions of overlapping photographs combine into remarkably detailed digital models, letting historians and engineers revisit the site again and again from laboratories thousands of miles away. In many ways, the archive beneath the Atlantic is more accessible to researchers today than at any point since the ship first vanished. Yet every new survey brings another reminder that time is still the most powerful force acting on the wreck. Iron-consuming microorganisms keep doing their slow work. Sections that look stable during one expedition can look noticeably different just a few years later. Decorative features fade. Structural elements weaken. The archive keeps changing even as investigators try to preserve it through documentation. That reality gives every expedition an unexpected sense of urgency. Researchers aren't just studying history anymore. They're racing to record evidence before history quietly disappears on its own. And as the technology improved and the archive grew more complete, investigators began noticing details pointing toward an even deeper mystery, one involving not individual artifacts or damaged steel, but patterns spread across the entire wreck site that had stayed almost invisible for decades. By the time researchers had stitched thousands of photographs into detailed digital maps, they weren't examining isolated discoveries anymore. They were starting to understand the wreck as a complete landscape. Seen from above, the site looks like far more than two separated sections resting on the seafloor. Stretching between the bow and the stern lies an enormous debris field covering thousands of feet, almost like pages of a history book scattered by the current. Every object holds a position that can be measured, compared, and interpreted. Nothing gets assumed to be meaningless. A single boiler, a fragment of wood, a piece of railing, a scrap of machinery, each one matters because of where it sits in relation to everything around it. This is where archaeology parts ways with treasure hunting. The value isn't in any single object. It's in context. Pull an artifact out without recording its exact location, and part of the story disappears for good. Leave it in place, document it carefully, and it might help explain a sequence of events no witness ever saw. That principle has guided modern expeditions for decades. Advances in autonomous underwater vehicles and high-resolution sonar let researchers survey the site with remarkable precision. Digital models now capture details measured in inches while preserving the relationships between thousands of individual features. These reconstructions let investigators explore the wreck again and again without disturbing it, comparing new observations against earlier surveys to spot even subtle changes. Those comparisons revealed something equally fascinating. The site isn't frozen in time. Every expedition documents gradual transformation. Rust-forming bacteria keep consuming exposed iron. Sections that once looked stable slowly weaken. Sediment shifts across the seafloor. Marine life claims new territory on surfaces that used to be bare. The archive itself keeps evolving, which means every survey becomes both a study of the past and a record of the present. Historians usually think of documents as permanent, but this one is slowly disappearing even while it keeps teaching us. That realization has shifted priorities within the scientific community. The goal isn't simply to discover what remains anymore. It's to preserve knowledge before more of it gets lost. Digital preservation has become just as important as physical exploration. Entire sections of the wreck can now be studied virtually by engineers, archaeologists, and historians around the world without anyone returning to the ocean floor. Yet even the most sophisticated technology can't answer everything. Measurements explain distances. Images reveal structures. Three-dimensional models preserve geometry. None of it fully explains why certain decisions unfolded the way they did during those final hours, and none of it can recover the evidence time has already erased. The deeper investigators look, the clearer one truth becomes. Every new discovery narrows the uncertainty in one area while widening it in another. Each answer uncovers another layer waiting to be explored. This wreck has become one of the most thoroughly documented archaeological sites in the world, and it keeps reminding researchers that history rarely gets solved all at once. It unfolds patiently through observation, comparison, and a willingness to let evidence reshape assumptions people have held for decades, even when the most important discovery turns out to be the new question it raises. After decades of exploration, one conclusion has become impossible to ignore. The greatest mysteries surrounding this wreck aren't about what investigators have already found. They're about what still can't be answered with real confidence. Modern technology transformed an inaccessible site into one of the most carefully documented archaeological locations on Earth, yet even millions of photographs, detailed sonar surveys, and highly accurate digital models haven't eliminated uncertainty. Instead, they've shown researchers exactly where the boundaries of their knowledge sit. One lasting question involves the countless details the ocean has already erased. Corrosion isn't simply damaging the wreck. It's slowly removing evidence future generations will never get to examine. Every year, fragile surfaces grow thinner. Decorative features fade. Compartments collapse. Researchers understand some questions may eventually become impossible to answer, not for lack of tools, but because time itself is altering the archive faster than anyone can record it. Another uncertainty comes from areas that remain extremely difficult to study. Remotely operated vehicles can reach remarkable locations, but not every space inside the wreck can be explored safely or responsibly. Some passages have grown too unstable. Others are blocked by collapsed structures or built-up sediment. Investigators constantly balance scientific curiosity against preservation, knowing that forcing access into fragile sections could destroy the very evidence they're trying to understand. There are also questions that belong less to engineering and more to history itself. How accurately can physical evidence reconstruct decisions made under rapidly changing circumstances more than a century ago? A photograph can show where an object rests today, but it can't always explain the sequence of choices that put it there. Measurements offer extraordinary precision, yet they can't fully capture human experience. This is where archaeology, history, and testimony still complement each other rather than compete. Each contributes its own kind of truth. Together, they create a far more complete picture than any single source ever could alone. Maybe the most fascinating mystery isn't hidden inside a sealed compartment or buried beneath sediment. It's the realization that every answer seems to generate another question. Better mapping reveals patterns nobody noticed before. Higher resolution imaging exposes details invisible to earlier expeditions. Advanced computer modeling now tests ideas that once relied entirely on educated speculation. Instead of wrapping up the investigation, each technological breakthrough widens the range of questions researchers get to ask. That's simply the nature of genuine historical inquiry. It rarely ends with certainty. It moves forward through better evidence and better questions. This perspective changes how we should look at the wreck. It isn't just the remains of a famous ship resting beneath the Atlantic anymore. It has become an active historical laboratory, one where science, archaeology, engineering, and careful documentation keep working together to sharpen our understanding of the past. Maybe the most valuable lesson here is that history is never truly finished. It stays open to revision whenever new evidence surfaces, and the quiet silence of the ocean keeps reminding investigators that some of its greatest secrets aren't hidden because they're impossible to find. They're hidden because the search for understanding is still far from complete. One assumption has quietly shaped public understanding for generations. Once a historic site gets discovered, documented, and studied, its importance usually fades as historians move on to the next mystery. This wreck did exactly the opposite. Instead of becoming less relevant with time, it grew more valuable, because each new generation carries tools the last one could only dream of. The questions researchers ask today aren't the same ones investigators asked in 1985, and they're certainly nothing like the ones raised during the official inquiries back in 1912. That evolution says something important about historical evidence itself. Evidence doesn't change, but our ability to understand it does. Improvements in imaging technology, digital reconstruction, materials science, and marine archaeology keep revealing details that stayed invisible for decades. A photograph once considered remarkably clear can now be enhanced, measured, and compared against thousands of additional images to build a far more complete picture of an entire section of the wreck. Three-dimensional mapping lets researchers study relationships between structures from angles no underwater vehicle could physically reach during a single dive. Artificial intelligence is starting to help historians spot subtle patterns across enormous collections of images, patterns that would once have taken years of manual comparison to notice. None of these advances rewrite history on their own. They simply let the evidence speak more clearly. This wreck has become more than a destination for exploration. It's become a benchmark for how modern science investigates the past. Engineers study structural failure. Oceanographers track long-term environmental change. Marine biologists observe ecosystems that have grown across the vessel over more than 100 years. Archaeologists document cultural heritage using methods that keep influencing underwater research around the world. Historians compare every new discovery against written records preserved in archives across multiple countries. Few historical sites bring together this many disciplines chasing the same goal. There's a broader lesson here too. History doesn't live only inside libraries or museums. Sometimes the most significant archives sit hidden in places that are almost impossible to reach. Their value isn't measured by public visibility. It's measured by the evidence they keep protecting. That idea has influenced how researchers approach other underwater sites, pushing for more careful documentation, more digital preservation, and more international cooperation before fragile evidence gets lost for good. Perhaps the greatest contribution of this whole investigation isn't a single discovery or one dramatic reveal. It's the demonstration that real understanding rarely arrives through certainty alone. It grows through patience, repeated observation, and a willingness to revise familiar stories once stronger evidence shows up. More than a century after the ship disappeared beneath the Atlantic, it's still serving an unexpected purpose. It teaches us the past isn't simply waiting to be remembered. It's waiting to be examined with fresh eyes, better questions, and enough humility to admit that even history's most famous stories might still hold chapters nobody has fully understood yet. That, more than any single artifact pulled from the seabed, may be the real discovery this wreck keeps offering to anyone patient enough to keep looking. More than 100 years have passed, and the remarkable truth is that this investigation still isn't finished. Every expedition has answered important questions, but none has delivered a final conclusion. Instead, each return to the site reveals how much is still left to learn from a place many once believed had already given up all its secrets. That might be the biggest surprise of all. This wreck has never behaved like a closed chapter of history. It behaves like an archive that reveals its contents one page at a time, rewarding patience over certainty. Looking back across every discovery, a clear pattern starts to emerge. The first generation relied on eyewitness testimony because that's all they had. The next added engineering analysis. Decades later, underwater exploration introduced direct physical evidence. Modern researchers expanded that work further with digital mapping, high-resolution imaging, advanced modeling, and collaboration across disciplines. Each generation inherited the work of the last, not by replacing it, but by refining it. That gradual process is the very foundation of historical investigation. Understanding grows stronger not because history changes, but because the evidence around it keeps getting more complete. At the same time, this wreck offers a lesson that reaches far beyond a single ship. It reminds us the past is rarely as simple as popular memory likes to suggest. Public imagination usually prefers clear endings, dramatic conclusions, and tidy explanations. Real history is rarely so accommodating. It's layered, incomplete, and constantly shaped by whatever evidence happens to be available at the time. The most responsible investigators aren't the ones who claim to have every answer. They're the ones willing to draw a line between what's confirmed, what's strongly supported, what remains uncertain, and what may never be known for sure. That approach turns curiosity into genuine understanding. Maybe that's why this wreck keeps fascinating people around the world. It isn't just a remarkable archaeological site or an extraordinary engineering case study. It's a reminder that discovery never really ends. Every improvement in technology opens the door to better questions. Every carefully documented survey preserves information future generations might interpret in ways we can't yet imagine. Even as the ocean slowly reshapes the site, it keeps challenging historians, engineers, archaeologists, and scientists to work together toward a fuller picture of the past. In the end, the greatest legacy resting beneath the Atlantic might not be the ship itself. It might be the example it sets for how history should be explored. With patience instead of haste. With evidence instead of assumption. With humility instead of certainty. The silence of the deep has never promised easy answers, but it has offered something more valuable. It reminds us every great mystery deserves careful investigation, and sometimes the most meaningful discoveries aren't the ones that settle every question. They're the ones that inspire us to keep searching with a little more wisdom than we had before. And somewhere in the darkness below, as this wreck continues its quiet transformation beneath the sea, there are almost certainly details no human eye has recognized yet, waiting for a future expedition to finally ask the one question that lets them be understood.